Good morning, dear students. David Copperfield, Chapter 10. Friendship. The title of this chapter is Friendship. David met Steerforth in London once more. Okay? David was introduced to Dora, a new character. Tommy Traddles. He met Tommy Traddles once more. David in Yarmouth. David went to Yarmouth once more. The first point. David met Steerforth in London. Okay? They met each other by coincidence, and Steerforth invited David to have dinner with him once, and David invited Steerforth to have dinner with him. They spent great time together, but on that day they drank a lot amount of wine. So David was or lost his mind a little bit. Okay? After dinner, he went to the theater with Steerforth to watch a play. And that he was drunk, as I told you. In the theater, while the play was performing, they met Agnes. David saw Agnes, and he stood up because he lost his mind a little bit. He called her name loudly, Agnes, Agnes, and that embarrassed Agnes very much. Okay? He met Agnes, and because he was drunk, he called to her name or her during the performance, and that Agnes became very embarrassed. When he went home, he thought of what did he do, and he decided to go to Agnes in the morning to apologize for her. Okay? When he went there, Agnes advised him that he was making a false friendship with Steerforth. She told him that Steerforth wasn't a good friend and that she didn't want him to be his friend. Okay? Then she told David about his father and that he was totally changed as his drinking habit increased to a great deal. Why? Because Uriah Heep always gave him wine all the time. So Uriah Heep controlled Mr. Wakefield completely, and he let him sign the papers, okay, which gave Steerforth Uriah Heep to control the work of Mr. Wakefield. Okay? David went to Agnes to apologize for his bad behavior, that he called her name loudly during the performance. When David went to her, she warned him about Steerforth, telling him that he had made a false friend. Okay? One day, Agnes visited David and told him that her father's condition had worsened and that Uriah Heep had been made partner in her father's firm. Partner. Now Uriah became Mr. Wakefield's partner. Okay? Agnes was very upset over this matter, and David couldn't understand why Mr. Wakefield would do such a thing. Why? Okay, they didn't know that Uriah Heep was the main reason of pushing Mr. Wakefield to drink a lot of wine all the day. He didn't realize how much of a hold Uriah Heep had over Mr. Wakefield. The second point. David was introduced to Dora. David was introduced to Dora. Who is Dora? Dora is Mr. Spenlow's daughter. Okay, David spent great time with Mr. Spenlow in the office, and he considered him his son. One day, Mr. Spenlow invited David to spend a weekend with him in his house. Okay, where he met Dora. When he went there, he saw a beautiful girl whose name was Dora, Spenlow, okay, and for his surprise, he found Miss Murdstone. Miss Murdstone was greatly changed to be a kind person. Okay, she was Dora's companion. After her mother's death, Miss Murdstone went to live with Dora as her stepmother, okay, but she didn't marry Mr. Spenlow. She used to take care of Dora and to be like her mother. Miss Murdstone tried to speak with David about the old time. He told her that she and her brother destroyed his life and his mother's life completely, and that he didn't want to speak with her about that in front of Dora. Okay? David fell in love with Dora the first moment he saw her. Dora was a spoiled girl. Mr. Spenlow spoiled his daughter very much. Okay? David completed his training. Now he completed his training and he started to work with Spenlow and Jerkins for £90 a year. £90 a year as a starting salary. He was then article at Spenlow and Jerkins at a salary of £90 a year, which was a good amount of money. Spenlow invited David to spend a weekend with him and his daughter Dora at his house. David met Miss Murdstone at Dora's house as she was her companion after her mother's death. Miss Murdstone, she tried to excuse herself for the way she and her brother had treated me, David. Here we meant David. But David told her that he didn't prefer to talk about the past again. He didn't want her to open any issue with him about the past time. Okay? David fell in love with Dora and wanted to ask her father for her hand in marriage. Dora also loved him in return. Tommy Traddles. The third point, Tommy Traddles. David went to visit Traddles, who was training to be a lawyer too, and they spent good time with each other, Tommy Traddles and David. David told him about Dora, and Traddles told him about his beloved, that he loved a girl and that he wanted to marry her, but he didn't have enough money to complete the marriage. So they waited till they saved some money to complete their marriage. Okay? Traddles told David that he had most of his meals with neighbors called the Micawbers. Micawbers again, once more. Now they were Traddles' neighbors. David was very happy to hear about the Micawbers once more. Every time he met them, the following day they left. Okay? So David was very happy for that, and he asked Traddles to go quickly and call Mr. Micawber. David invited them here, Traddles and Mr. Micawber, to dinner, and they spent good time together till the arrival of Steerforth. Steerforth went to them and he gave David a letter from Pigotti. David was very astonished that Steerforth went to Yarmouth without telling him, and he returned back with a letter from Pigotti to him. Steerforth returned everything by giving David a letter from Pigotti. David was surprised as Steerforth went to Yarmouth without telling him. David went to Yarmouth. Pigotti told David in the letter that Mr. Parkes was very ill and that she wanted him to be beside her. When David went to Yarmouth, he found Mr. Parkes very sick, and he went immediately to sit beside him. Mr. Parkes spoke with him in a very weak voice, and they remembered the previous days. Mr. Parkes told him, "Do you remember the word Mr. Parkes dwelling? And when he loved, he died." Mr. Parkes died. They were very sad for that. David decided to stay with Pigotti till the end of the funeral. Okay, and they kept searching for Mr. Parkes' well, whether he left her money or not. How would Pigotti live after her husband's death? Okay, so they found a box. They found a box with a good amount of money, and a paper told them that he had 3,000 pounds in a bank in London. Okay, Mr. Parkes left money for all of them. He left a small amount of money for Emily, Mr. Pigotti, Ham, and even David. Okay, and the biggest amount was for his wife Pigotti. Pigotti told David that Mr. Parkes was ill. When David went there, he found him in bed. David stayed beside Mr. Parkes and remembered the old days. David went to Mr. Pigotti's house and saw Emily, Ham, and Mrs. Gummidge. Do you remember Mrs. Gummidge? The one who used to boil seafood for them. Mr. Parkes died and left Pigotti some money to live a comfortable life. David stayed with Pigotti until the funeral was over. She decided to return to London with David to execute Mr. Parkes' will. What does it mean? She returned back with David to London to take the money that Mr. Parkes left her in the bank. Okay? David went to say goodbye to Ham and Mr. Pigotti and Emily. For his surprise, a very bad thing happened. Ham arrived home, okay, very wet, with a letter from Emily. David took the letter from Ham and he started to read it loudly. Ham asked him not to read the letter loudly as he didn't want Mr. Pigotti to know anything. Unfortunately, Mr. Pigotti was by the door and he listened carefully to the letter. That letter was from Emily, who wrote to them telling them that she escaped with a man, and that man was Steerforth. Okay, she ran away with him. She promised them that she would never return back unless he married her. Okay? David went to say goodbye. Ham arrived wet with a letter from Emily. David read a letter and knew that Emily had left home and ran away with Steerforth. Mr. Pigotti decided to find her and never return home without Emily. He decided to find her everywhere. Okay? He went alone. He didn't want to take Ham with him. And that was a great surprise for Mr. Pigotti. That surprise broke his heart and destroyed his plans for Emily, as he considered Emily his own daughter. Okay? This is the end of